The morning I carried her home, she fit inside my coat pocket. Not a metaphor, she actually fit. I'd folded the left side of my grandfather's Carhartt over my chest, and she lay in there against my ribs, weighing maybe 3 pounds, her ears flat, her breathing shallow and damp. The woman at the neighboring farm had told me not to bother. She'd said it without cruelty, the way you tell someone not to water a dead plant. The runt of a border collie litter, 5 weeks old, the mother had already stopped nursing her. The other 4 pups were fat and scrapping in the corner of the whelping box. This one was against the wall, not moving much, eyes half closed. She won't make it to Friday, the woman said. Her name was Darlene, and she'd been running dogs on her property for 22 years. She knew what she was talking about. I understood that. I took the puppy anyway. That was March 14th, T20T2. A Tuesday. I had been running Caldwell Farm alone for exactly 6 months. I want to back up, because the dog is only part of this story. She's the center of it. The whole shape of the thing bends around her. But to understand what she meant to me that March, you have to understand what November had looked like. You have to understand what I walked into when I drove my 2009 Ford Ranger down the county road. For the first time as the owner, not the granddaughter. When I stepped out onto 6 feet of frozen mud in Harlan County, Kentucky, and looked at 31 acres that everyone in a 40-mile radius had already decided I was going to lose. My grandfather had died on September 3rd. He was 78. He'd been running Caldwell Farm since 1987, when he bought the original 20 acres from a family named Petty, who'd given up on tobacco and didn't want to watch someone else try. He added 11 more acres in 1994, and the last parcel, the East Field, the one with the creek and the broken fence line, in 2001. He kept records of everything in a series of green ledger books he stored in a locked tin box under his workbench. He left me the farm, the box, the Ranger, and $4,700 in a checking account at First Community Bank of Harlan. He did not leave me any instructions. I had the ledger books, and I had the land, and I had every neighbor, lender, and county extension agent within driving distance quietly waiting for me to fold. I was 19 years old. I had finished 1 semester of agricultural studies at Eastern Kentucky University before I dropped out to come home. I'd never run a farm alone. I'd never negotiated a feed contract or filed for a grazing permit or convinced a bank that a 19-year-old woman was a reasonable credit risk. But I had my grandfather's coat, and now I had the dog. Her name was Clover. I didn't choose it. It was written on the intake card the rescue had filled out in blue ballpoint, and there was something about changing it that felt wrong, like I'd be erasing the only record that anyone had thought to name her at all. Clover. I kept it. She weighed 11 pounds when I loaded her into the cab of the Ranger on a Thursday in late October. The rescue coordinator, a woman with sun-damaged forearms and a clipboard she kept checking twice, told me not to get attached to any expectations. The litter had been found in a collapsed equipment shed off Route 119, 5 pups and a mother who'd already been spoken for. 4 of the pups had gone in the first hour of the adoption event. Clover had not. Her left hind leg had a slight drag to it, a nerve issue. The coordinator thought, possibly from being pressed against the shed wall before they were found. It might resolve. It might not. She was 9 weeks old and the color of old straw, with one ear that stood up and one that didn't. I drove her home on a back road that follows the creek for about 6 miles before it climbs up to our ridge. She sat on the passenger seat and did not make a sound. She watched the tree line the whole way, her good ear tracking things I couldn't hear. When I pulled into the yard and cut the engine, she looked at me for the first time, directly, the way animals sometimes do when they're deciding something. And then she put her chin on my knee and held it there for a long moment before I opened the door. That was the whole beginning of it. I had no illusions about her being useful right away. She was too small, too uncertain on that leg, and too young to be anything but a liability near the chickens. I'd fenced off a section of the mudroom with a piece of hardware cloth my grandfather had stored in the barn rafters, and I put her there at night with an old feed sack folded into a bed. She didn't cry. Most puppies cry the first night away from their litter. Clover didn't. She curled into the sack and slept like she'd been waiting for a quiet place. I wrote in my own notebook that first night, a habit I'd picked up from my grandfather without realizing it until I was already doing it. I noted her weight, her intake, the drag in her gait. I noted that the east fence needed 3 new posts before the ground froze. I noted the balance in the first community account and the upcoming payment on the operating loan I'd taken in September, which I had not yet told any of my neighbors about, because I already knew what they would say. The morning after I brought her home, my nearest neighbor came up the drive in his truck. His truck was a '98 Chevy, dark green, with a cracked side mirror he'd replaced with duct tape sometime around 2019 and never fixed properly. He was 63 years old and had farmed the adjacent 240 acres for longer than I'd been alive. He was not a bad man. I want to be clear about that. He was the kind of man who had helped my grandfather pull a stuck tractor out of the creek bed in April of 2011, and he had sat in our kitchen the day of the funeral and eaten his pie quietly and left an envelope on the counter that I found 3 days later with $200 cash in it and no note. He was not cruel. He was just certain. He got out of the truck without being invited, which was normal out here, and he walked to the porch and looked at me through the screen door and said he'd heard I'd taken a dog from the Macomber place. I said yes. He said the Runt. I said yes. He looked at the mudroom window for a moment. Clover was visible through the glass, standing with her nose pressed to the hardware cloth, watching him with that flat, attentive gaze she already had even at 7 weeks old. He said she'd never be worth the feed. Said he wasn't trying to be hard on me, said he was being practical, said that Leg would always be a problem, and a farm dog that couldn't run the fence line was just a pet, and I didn't have the margin for pets right now, and he figured I already knew that. I told him I appreciated him stopping by. He stood there another moment. Then he looked out over the east field, and I could see him doing the arithmetic he always did, the arithmetic of what this place was worth versus what I owed, versus how long a 19-year-old girl could realistically hold 112 acres together. Through a Wisconsin winter, I'd seen that same calculation on the face of the loan officer at First Community in September. I'd seen it on the face of the county extension agent when he'd driven out in October to look at the hay yield numbers. There was a particular expression men of a certain age put on when they looked at me and then looked at this farm, and I had learned to recognize it the way you learn to recognize the smell of rain coming before the sky actually changes. He said if I ever wanted to talk about my options, I knew where he lived. I said I did. He got back in the truck and left. I went inside and sat on the mudroom floor with Clover in my lap and opened my notebook to the page from the night before. Underneath the entry about the east fence posts, I wrote the date, November 14th, and one line beneath it. Then I turned the page and started the feeding log. The line I had written was, "They are counting on me failing." Not as complaint, as fact. I put it down the way I would have written. East gate latch needs replacing. Something observed, something to account for. Then I closed the notebook and went to feed the pigs. Clover had been sleeping in the mudroom since early October when the nights first dropped below freezing. She was not supposed to be a house dog. My grandfather had kept his dogs in the barn, and I understood the logic of that. A farm dog who sleeps warm gets soft, gets distracted, loses the sharp edge that makes her useful. But Clover was 3 pounds, and mostly rib when I brought her home in April, and the barn in October was no place for something still learning to be alive. I told myself it was temporary. By November, I had stopped telling myself anything about it and just moved her water bowl closer to the kitchen door where it wouldn't freeze. Overnight, the pigs were in the south pen. 4 of them, Berkshire crosses my grandfather had bought from a farm in Richland County this spring, before he died. They were not friendly animals. They were not supposed to be. I fed them from the far side of the gate and watched them eat, which is something I had started doing with all the animals, just watching for 10 minutes after the morning feeding before I moved on. The county extension agent had told me it was a waste of time. He had actually used those words. "That's a waste of time, ma'am." I had nodded and kept doing it. The 3rd pig from the left was favoring her right front leg. She had been doing it for 2 days, which I had logged but not yet acted on. I watched her eat, watched the weight distribution shift every time she moved toward the trough, and I noted the angle of the foot. I went back to the mudroom, checked my grandfather's veterinary manual, a green-spined paperback from 1979 with half the pages flagged with strips of paper towel, found what I was looking for, and wrote down what I would need from the feed store in Boscobel before the end of the week. This was the work, not dramatic, not visible to anyone who drove past on County Road F and looked at the fields and made their calculations, just watching, writing down what you see, acting on it before it becomes a crisis rather than after. My grandfather had understood this. I knew it from his logs, which I had been reading since August. 3 decades of spiral-bound notebooks stacked in the office closet, each one labeled on the spine in his tight handwriting. He had not been a man who spoke much, from what I gathered from the neighbors who remembered him. But he had watched everything, and he had written it all down, and somewhere in those notebooks was the farm as it had been. I just hadn't reached the important ones yet. The notebooks were organized by year, not by season, and he had kept one for each year, going back to 1961. That was 38 notebooks, most of them the same brand, Mead 5-star, college ruled, black cover, stacked in 3 columns in the back of the office closet, behind a box of receipts nobody had touched since 1994. The earliest ones had dried out badly along the spine. A few pages crumbled when I turned them. I was careful, and still I lost some edges. I had started reading in August because I needed to understand the pasture rotation. The previous tenant, a man named Delbert Haas, who had leased the back 40 acres from my grandfather for almost 12 years before my grandfather's health made the arrangement collapse, had left the east pasture in poor shape. And I didn't trust my own instincts enough yet to make the call on when to move the animals and when to rest the ground, so I went to the notebooks. But what I found in them was larger than pasture schedules. My grandfather had kept records of everything, not just the farm, the neighbors, the weather, the prices at the Richland County Co-op, which changed every winter and which he tracked with the same consistency he tracked his own. Expenses. He had noted when the Halverson place changed hands in 1978. He had noted what the new owners paid, and what they had promised the bank, and what happened 6 years later when neither promise held. He had noted the name of every litter born on this property, every lamb, every calf, and in several entries he had noted something else. Small behavioral observations about individual animals. Which ones watched the gate? Which ones stayed close to the fence during a storm instead of moving to the center of the field? Which ones, as he put it in November 1983, seemed to think? That entry stopped me the first time I read it. He had been writing about a dog. Not a working dog in the formal sense. He hadn't run sheepdogs as far as I knew. But there was a female in the 1983 log that he mentioned across 6 or 7 entries between July and December of that year, always in passing, always as a side note to something else. She had appeared on the property in June, he wrote, thin and favoring her left rear leg, and he had kept her because she was too young to have traveled far alone, and because she had what he called, without further explanation, the right kind of quiet. I had read that line in October and written it into my own notebook without fully understanding why. By the time I was standing at the fence on that Wednesday morning in late November, watching the runt move across the frozen mud toward the water trough, I had not yet connected my grandfather's 1983 dog to anything I was doing now. That connection would come later, and it would not arrive in the way I expected. The runt reached the trough and drank for a long time. I watched the muscles along her jaw work, watched the small cloud of vapor that rose each time she lifted her head. She was still thin, thinner than I wanted her to be at 11 weeks, but the thinness was becoming something else. It was becoming the lean, particular architecture of a dog that was deciding what it was going to be. Her ribs no longer showed when she moved. Her legs, which had trembled in the truck cab the night I brought her home, now planted themselves with a quiet certainty against the frozen mud. The neighbor from the far side of the county road had stopped by again that Tuesday the day before, asking after her. He was the 3rd person in 2 weeks to do so. He ran a small cattle operation on 80 acres north of me, the kind of man who kept his fences tighter than most and didn't waste conversation. And he had been skeptical when I told him in October what the runt had come from. He had looked at her through the wire fence of the isolation pen with the expression of a man doing arithmetic in his head and not liking the sum. But something had shifted in him since then. On Tuesday, he stood at the same fence, leaning on the top rail, and he was quiet for a long time before he spoke. He asked if I'd thought about what I was going to do with pups when the time came. I told him I hadn't gotten that far yet. He nodded slowly, the way men do when they're filing something away rather than acknowledging it. She was too young to be thinking about any of that, of course. Not for another year, at least, probably longer. But the fact that he had asked meant something. He was the kind of man whose opinion moved in a county like ours the way water moved through clay. Slowly and then all at once. If he was standing at my fence asking questions, others had been watching. I went back inside and pulled out my grandfather's 1983 log from the kitchen shelf where I'd been keeping it since October. I turned to the July entry, the first mention of the female who had appeared on the property thin and limping, the one he had kept because she had the right kind of quiet. There was something I had noticed in that entry before but not examined closely. His handwriting in the 1983 log was smaller than in later years, more compressed, as if he were trying to fit something extra onto each page. And in the margin beside the July entry, in a slightly different pencil, he had written a single word I had initially taken for a name. I sat down at the kitchen table, where the light from the window came in flat and gray across the page, and I looked at that word again. The word was Norsk. I sat with it for a long time. The light moved across the page the way it does in November, not warming anything, just marking time. Norsk. Not a name, a nationality, a breed designation maybe, or something close to one. I had grown up hearing the dogs on this property called simply the farm dogs or the line, as if they were continuous with the land itself rather than animals with a particular origin. My grandfather had never been a man who used unnecessary words, so the fact that he had written that one in a different pencil in the margin, as if it were a correction or an addition he'd come back to make, that mattered. I went to the shelf beside the wood stove, where I kept the reference books that had come with the farm. Most of them were soil manuals and a 1974 edition of a Midwest livestock guide with water stains on the cover. But there was one thin paperback near the back, its spine so faded I had never thought to pull it. A working dog breed survey, the kind sold at agricultural extension offices in the early 1980s. I brought it to the table. I found the section I was looking for on page 41, Norwegian Buhund, Spitz type, originally used by Norse farmers and herdsmen, medium build, high intelligence. Exceptionally strong herding instinct, combined with an unusual capacity for independent problem solving. The book described a breed that had been used for both livestock and personal protection, that bonded closely with a single handler, and that had been brought to working farms in the upper Midwest in limited numbers through a small network of importers and agricultural breeders in the late 1970s and early 1980s. I read that last sentence twice. The female my grandfather had found in July of 1983, thin and limping, with the right kind of quiet, had not simply wandered in from somewhere. She had come from somewhere specific, which meant the line I had been working with, the line that had produced the runt I had nearly lost in February, had not been the accidental thing I had always understood it to be. It had been a deliberate thing, or at least the beginning of one. I closed the book and looked out the window toward the barn. The runt was visible from where I sat. She was in the yard, moving along the fence line in the particular focused way she had, the way that Mr. Aldrich had watched for 10 minutes without speaking. She was not running, she was thinking. You could see it in the way she stopped, adjusted her angle, continued. 8 months old, and she moved with the kind of economy that takes most working dogs 2 or 3 years to develop. I thought about the woman my grandfather had written about, the thin one who had appeared in July, limping with something in her he had recognized. I pulled out my own notebook and started writing down what I knew. What I knew was not much, but it was more than I had started with in February. I wrote it out in columns the way my grandfather had, the left side for what I could confirm, the right side for what I was inferring. On the left, one female, 8 months old, runt of a litter of 6, born February 11th on a Tuesday during the ice storm that had knocked out the power to the whole east side of Harlan County for 31 hours. On the left also, a grandmother in the line, origin unknown to me until 40 minutes ago. On the right, that grandmother had not been astray, that somebody had brought her or pointed her here, or she had found this particular farm by some orientation I didn't have a name for yet. There was a name in the ledger. My grandfather had written it in the margin of the July entry lightly, like he wasn't sure it belonged there. a surname only, Voss. I didn't recognize it. That meant either the family had moved on, or I simply hadn't been paying attention to the right things. Both were possible. I sat with the notebook open in my lap for a while, watching her work the fence line. She had found something in the far corner, near the gate post, and she was investigating it with her nose 6 inches from the ground, and her whole body still except for that nose. When she finally looked up, she looked directly at the window where I was sitting. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then she went back to the corner. I am not someone who assigns meaning to things that don't have it. I have watched enough animals to know the difference between a dog looking at a window and a dog communicating something. That was just a dog looking at a window, but I wrote down the time anyway, 4:47 in the afternoon, last week of October. The light had gone flat, and the yard smelled like wood smoke from the Hendersons' place half a mile east. That evening I called the County Historical Society. They were closed, which I had expected, so I left a message with the name Voss and a brief description of what I was looking for. Any record of a family in this part of the county with working dogs, specifically herding dogs, going back to the 1960s or earlier. I kept my voice neutral and factual because I knew how the question sounded, and I didn't want whoever listened to the message to file it under eccentric. I went back out to the barn at dusk. She followed me from the gate, not at my heel the way a trained dog follows, but at a slight offset, watching the perimeter while I walked. It was something nobody had taught her. It was something she simply did. I filled the water buckets and stood in the middle of the barn floor for a moment, listening to the sounds the farm made when it thought nobody was paying attention. The Historical Society called back on a Thursday morning, 2 days later. The woman on the phone had a careful voice, the kind that belongs to someone who has spent decades handling other people's fragile things. She said she had found something, but she wanted to describe it rather than read it directly, because the handwriting was difficult and she didn't want to mislead me. There had been a Voss family in the county from approximately 1948 through the early 1980s. The husband had come from somewhere in Minnesota, the wife from Wisconsin. They had worked a property about 11 miles northeast of where I was standing. She gave me a road name I recognized, because it was the same dirt road that ran along the back edge of my grandfather's pasture before the county rerouted it in 1987. They had kept livestock, primarily sheep, and they had bred working dogs for that operation and for sale. The woman at the Historical Society paused there and said border collies specifically, and a line they had developed themselves over roughly 15 years. I wrote that down, 15 years. She said the family had left the county abruptly in 1971 or 1972. She wasn't certain of the exact year, and that the property had passed through 3 owners since then. Whatever dogs they left behind or sold, there was no further record. The breeding records themselves were private and wouldn't have been archived. But she had found one thing, a single photograph in a collection donated by a local farm supply owner who had passed away in 2019. The photograph was labeled on the back in pencil. It showed a man and a woman standing at a fence line and at their feet 2 dogs. She read the label to me slowly. The dogs in the photograph were described as the foundation pair. The female's name was written in the same careful pencil, and it was a name I did not recognize, but below it, in what appeared to be a different hand, someone had added a single word I did not expect. She spelled it out. It was a word that meant, the unbroken line continues. I thanked her and stayed still at the kitchen table for a long moment after we hung up. Outside the window, the dog was lying at the edge of the porch with her head on her front paws, watching the far tree line. She had been doing that more in the last week, watching the distance, tracking something I couldn't see or hear. I looked at what I had written in my notebook. 15 years foundation pair, 11 miles northeast, the same road. I picked up my pen and drew a slow line connecting the dates. The line I drew connected 3 points. My grandfather's first entry about the breeding program, October 1987, the year the woman 11 miles northeast said her family had acquired their first dog from a breeder in this county, 1989, and the date on the back of the photograph her daughter had found, summer 1991. 2 years between each mark. The kind of spacing that isn't coincidence, it's method. I sat with that for a while before I did anything else. The dog lifted her head from her paws and looked back at me through the glass. She had a way of doing that, checking in, then returning to whatever she was tracking on the horizon, that made me feel watched over rather than watched. I wrote that down too, because it seemed like the kind of thing worth recording even if I didn't know yet what it meant. The next morning I drove the 11 miles. It was a Tuesday, the last week of February, and the road was still patched with ice in the low places where the sun hadn't reached since November. I brought my notebook and the photograph my grandfather had left in the ledger, the one of him standing at the fence with a dog that looked like her. Grandmother or her great-grandmother, the lineage already legible in the posture, in the set of the ears. The woman who answered the door was in her 70s. She had the careful, unhurried manner of someone who had spent a long time around working animals and had absorbed something of their patience. She looked at the photograph I held out for about 4 seconds before she nodded once and stepped back to let me in. Her kitchen smelled like wood smoke and coffee and something I couldn't name, something old and dry and good, like a chest of cedar that had been closed for years and just opened. On the wall above the table, she had a framed photograph of her own, larger, taken in what looked like the late 1990s. I recognized the fence line. She poured 2 cups without asking and sat across from me. She said she had been wondering when someone from that farm would come looking. She said she had kept records. She said the word her daughter had found on the back of the photograph. The one in the different hand, the one that meant the unbroken line continues, had been written by her husband the year before he died, because he had wanted someone to know. She pushed a binder across the table. It was thick, with tabs marked by year. I opened it to the first page and stopped. My grandfather's name was there at the top in his handwriting. The binder was organized by year going back to 1987. Each tab held 3 or 4 pages of handwritten notes, breeding dates, litter sizes, weights at 8 weeks, health records, buyer's initials, prices. The handwriting changed twice over the decades, the same way a river changes character as it moves through different terrain, but the system stayed consistent throughout. Someone had cared about this record the way you care about something you plan to hand down. She let me turn the pages without interrupting. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and watched me read the way people watch someone open a letter they've been holding for a long time. My grandfather's name appeared 6 times in the first year alone, not as a buyer, as a source. He had given them dogs, or lent them, or agreed to some arrangement that the notes described in shorthand I had to work out slowly. The abbreviation he used was 2 letters, and when I finally understood it, I had to read the line 3 more times to be sure. It meant co-ownership. He had kept half interest in every dog he placed with them for the first 3 years of the arrangement. He had not been giving the line away. He had been distributing it carefully, the way a farmer plants the same seed in separate fields as insurance against a single flood. I turned to the tab marked 1994. There was a note in different ink, added later, that said the arrangement had ended by mutual agreement after his wife's health declined and he needed to simplify. But the note also said that the bloodline agreement remained honored in spirit, that they would not sell outside of that understanding without first offering return to the originating farm. I looked up. She was watching me. I asked her how many of the dogs she had now traced back to that line. She held up 4 fingers, 4 dogs. One of them was the grandmother of every litter she'd produced in the last 6 years. She said her husband had believed the line was exceptional not for any single trait but for the combination, the steadiness with livestock, the unusual threshold for stress, the way the dogs read movement before it became a problem. He had called it anticipatory calm. He'd written that phrase in the binder in 1998 and underlined it twice. I thought about Rue. I thought about the way she had stood at the fence that first September morning watching the goats, not chasing, not reacting, just reading. I thought about how the vet had said she was unremarkable. I thought about what the word unremarkable means when someone says it quickly. Without looking, she pushed a second binder across the table. This one was thinner. The tab on the first section was marked with my grandfather's initials. My hands were not steady when I opened it. The first page was a letter, handwritten, dated March 14, 1991. My grandfather's name was at the top, not in his handwriting, but in her husband's. It thanked him for the breeding agreement, confirmed the terms, and then, in the 3rd paragraph, said something I had to read twice. It said that the female he had sent, the one my grandfather had called unremarkable, too nervous, too small, had produced the finest working litter they had seen in 11 years. That she had passed to every pup a quality that could not be named in a registration document. That her husband intended to retire her with full honors when her time came, and that he would consider it a privilege to keep this line going between the two farms for as long as both families were willing. My grandfather had written a response in the margin, in pencil, just 4 words. I knew she would. I sat with that for a long time. She gave me copies of everything. The breeding records, the lineage charts going back to 1979, the letters between the farms. She gave me a photograph of my grandfather standing in front of the same fence I stand at now, holding a dog I didn't recognize but whose posture I knew exactly. That particular stillness, that particular way of watching. I drove home with the binder on the passenger seat. Rue met me at the gate. She did not bark. She stood there in the early dark, reading my face the way she reads the goats, and then she turned and walked beside me toward the house, 7 pups. All placed now, every one of them on working farms within 60 miles, all placed with the same agreement written into the paperwork, not because anyone required it, because it was right. The man at the co-op stopped me last week and said he'd heard I was breeding dogs now. He said it the way people say things when they're deciding whether to be impressed. I told him I wasn't breeding dogs. I was continuing something my grandfather started. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, which was fine. The vet who called Rue unremarkable left the practice in January. I don't know where she went. If you've ever been handed something that looked like a burden and turned out to be the whole point, I'd like to hear about it. Leave it in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who's been underestimated lately. They might need to hear that the unremarkable ones sometimes change everything.